What's good, creative fam? Brandon Washington here, and just the other day I got my first hands-on experience with the Canon EOS R5. Now, pretty much since this camera was officially announced, it has been shrouded in controversy around if this camera is a flop due to the overheating issues. Now, sure, there have been a ton of videos released going over if this camera is a complete failure because of the overheating, but I wanted to test this camera out myself because as a YouTuber myself, I know that it's easy to ride the trends and put out overheating video after overheating video because they're pretty much guaranteed to get views. Now, for my first on-hand experience, my time with the camera was, well, honestly, it was extremely limited. So I had to get a few tests in and be very precise about what I wanted to test. I also was aware that, yeah, some of the overheating limitations were going to kind of alter my tests a little bit. So I had to actually set up my shots specifically in order to capture what I needed for my tests. On top of that, I was gonna have less than 6 hours with the camera, and I needed to test out three main things. How did the camera actually capture 4K 24 frames per second? How did it capture higher frame rates? And of course, what did 8K look like coming out of this camera? A few other things I needed to know was how was the dynamic range and if the Canon mirrorless lineup had improved it any. And then last but certainly not least, I needed to know how easy it was going to actually be to use this camera. So without wasting any time, I grabbed the camera, a lens, a gimbal, and I went out and shot. Now my plan with this camera was simple: to shoot it in a systematic routine to help keep the camera from overheating. See, I wasn't trying to make the camera overheat in any way. So for this, I started with test number one, which was to shoot the camera in 4K 24 frames per second. Now, immediately as I began shooting with this camera, I realized how easy it was to actually shoot this camera. If you've ever shot with any Canon cameras in the past, you'll feel right at home with this camera. For this test, I shot a quick little walking scene with my buddy Kyle, who was actually letting me use the camera in order to work with it. And it was working great. Just like most people who've experienced the 4K on this camera, it looks very sharp. And as far as the camera is concerned, I experienced no overheating issues whatsoever. So it is currently 97 degrees outside in Houston, Texas. I've been shooting on the EOS R5 for the last about an hour, and we've been shooting in 4K 24 and 4K 60, and so far, no overheating issues. Now, that being said, initially, I wasn't very blown away with the dynamic range. However, this test really didn't push it as much as I wanted to, so I planned on testing out the dynamic range a little bit further on in the shoot. Looking back on the footage now, I have to say the 4K looks great. However, so did the 4K on the EOS R. Now, the major benefit was the fact that this 4K had no crop. So you're getting complete full frame 4K, which is amazing. Canon was kind of slacking on that for a long time. Also, for this test, everything was shot in 4K high quality mode in all eyes. So for all of you who want to know what, parameters I shot this in, those are the parameters, and those are going to be the same parameters for all the 4K footage you're going to see later on in this video as well. Now, as I mentioned before, I wasn't initially ecstatic about the dynamic range I saw coming out of this camera in the first test, but so I decided to actually really test this. So in this next shot, I actually had Kyle up against the bright sky with no additional lighting on him and realized something very interesting with this camera. This camera does a phenomenal job at preserving details in the shadows. However, if your highlights appear to be clipped at all, the detail is gone and there's almost no way of really recovering it. So just a little tip for all of you guys who are out there shooting: if you're shooting up against a bright lighting source, I would highly recommend underexposing your clip just slightly and then pull back all the detail in the shadows like I did with this clip. Now for the second test, I wanted to shoot this in some higher frame rates. So for this, I started off shooting in 4K 60 frames per second. Now typically 60 frames per second is my go-to frame rate mode. In my opinion, it gives the perfect option of slow motion without things seeming to be too slow. Also at 60 frames per second, this is where most people began to start experiencing some overheating issues. At about this time, we were about an hour or so into shooting and I had experienced no issues. That wasn't until I did. We are dealing with some overheating stuff, but it doesn't look like you normally would think it would. It just took my record time down to 10 minutes and I just had over 10 minutes on the card. So it is obviously dealing with some type of heat. Obviously this is just because we just switched into 4K 60. But we're gonna just keep shooting it and see how long it actually gives us. And I'll see if I switch it back. Actually, right now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna switch it back into 4K 24 and see if it gives me that time back. Okay, so I switched it back to 4K 24 and it gives me my time back. So now I'm back to having 22 minutes to record. So I guess if you start to see your camera is overheating, just switch it back to a more usable resolution and frame rate and hopefully you'll be okay. I don't know. We'll keep shooting and find out. I began to notice that my first overheating indicator came in when my recording time suddenly dropped to 10 minutes. Now my card was a CF Express card, which clearly had plenty of available space, and I was not limited to the amount of space I had on my card, but I was being limited because of the heat. Again, our time with the camera was limited, so I had to just kind of push on and keep filming. So the 4K 60 out of this camera looked amazing. Even at 60 frames per second, I struggled on getting an adequate amount of dynamic range, as you can clearly see in some of these shots like this one here at the staircase. No matter how hard I tried, I was unable to expose for both Kyle and the sky, but the shots that I got in the shade looked great. Now the next thing I needed to run through on this camera was 4K 120. It's been a while since I shot 120 frames per second because my Blackmagic, there's like this insane crop on the lens when you're shooting at 120 frames per second, which is basically unusable. So although I don't use 120 often, I still thought it'd be cool to see what the 4K 120 looked like on this camera, and oh man, did it look amazing. I mean, personally, I think the shots at 4K 120 were probably some of my favorite shots that we got. These shots looked absolutely stunning. Now, while out shooting, we found this girl who was fairly new to skateboarding, but she still agreed to let us get some shots of her skating around, and the motion looks so smooth coming out of this camera. Now, 120 frames is baked in footage. Now, honestly, I don't think that's really that much of an issue. It looks so good coming straight out of camera that I don't really see the need of having 120 frames in any other way. Now, as we continued shooting, the overheating quickly became more of an issue. At this point, I wasn't even sure if we were going to be able to finish shooting all of our tests before the camera just like completely gave out, or if my time with the camera was going to run out, because as I mentioned, I only had like roughly 5.5 to 6 hours to actually shoot it.
Gotcha.
Ooh, that's hot. Ooh, that's real hot. Not to mention, there were some pretty nasty clouds beginning to form above us. So for test number 3, I quickly switched the camera over into 8K and began to capture some footage of my friend's sticks to test out this final feature. As soon as I switched the camera over into 8K, I noticed the timer dropped down to 5 minutes. Now, I didn't need any long takes, just a couple short shots to create a sequence, but this time limit definitely made me feel a bit more nervous. Now, shooting, this is obviously not something you want to feel while you're trying to be creative, but I had no time to soak in it. I just had to suck it up and get out there and keep getting my shots. I got about 3 shots before the timer dropped down to 2 minutes. I rushed sticks into frame and started shooting some more, just like that. This was obviously not exactly what I had expected, but I was semi-prepared for this. My time with the 8K was significantly shorter than what I was hoping for, but I was able to capture a handful of shots before the camera gave out. On the plus side, I was able to switch the camera back down into 4K 60, and when I did have some time still remaining. However, that time was really short as well. But when I switched the camera down to 4K 24 frames per second or 1080, I was back to my typical limitless record time, or pretty much whatever my memory card had left. I started to shoot again to get a couple other extra shots, but just as quickly as the camera overheated, the rain followed. All right, that's a wrap on the EOS R5 review because it's starting to rain, and that's all the time I got with it. You can definitely be on the lookout for a future video where I'm gonna go more in depth, but this is kind of just like my first look. And just like that, my time with the EOS R5 was done. Now, obviously, with my time being so short with the camera, I cannot call this video really a review. I have a unit coming in about a week or so, and during that time, I'm going to continue to test out the camera to give you guys a complete review on this camera. On top of that, I'm actually shooting a wedding tomorrow with this guy, and so I'll be bringing this camera out to test it in a real world scenario. And don't worry, I'm bringing a backup camera for inevitably when this camera overheats, so that way I can quickly just switch over to that other camera and not miss any shots. For more information on this in a future video, make sure you hit that subscribe button because I'm going to be dropping a lot more content on the EOS R5 very soon. Now, even though this is not a full review, here are a few of my thoughts on this camera. First, the specs on this camera are a dream come true. However, is this a perfect camera? No. And does it overheat? Yes. But do I think it's as big of a deal as the internet's really making it out to be? No. At the end of the day, this is a mirrorless camera, and if you are a professional video shooter, you should really be considering using a cinema camera, especially in today's time in 2020, because there are so many affordable options out there and obviously more reliable options out there for you to be filming with. Now, if you are a content creator who's going out, getting some shots, shooting some video here and there from time to time and taking some photos, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with how little the overheating issue will be for you. I mean, we shot out with this camera in 97-degree heat in Houston, Texas for almost 6 hours before we experienced any serious overheating issues, and that was shooting non-stop in multiple different frame rates and resolutions. Now, sure, a lot of people are still skeptical of the overheating issues, and is this something that should be a deal breaker for you? I wish I could give you a concrete answer on that, but for someone who is a professional video shooter and you are planning on picking up the R5 as your only camera, you should probably look elsewhere, just being honest. Now, take this all with a grain of salt, but know that I will have more EOS R footage and video content for you guys very soon. Also, if you are interested in learning more about filmmaking and improving your skills, be sure to check out the Creative Film Academy. There you will find new training courses and content monthly, along with production assets such as contract templates, LUTs, and much more. On top of that, we are actually adding a new section on the site right now for courses that are coming soon, which include an entire EOS R5 shooting guide. So thank you guys so much for checking out this video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.